I'm Austin.
I'm Mike.
We are the test drivers.
And we put tech through its paces.
Mike, I have a big question for you.
Existential, this one.
Do you know what a computer is? Have you heard of this thing called a computer yet?
What is a computer?
Well, I have a wonderful Apple ad I can show you all about why the iPad is and or is not
I am
a
a
computer.
defender of that ad, by the way. I mean, I think even people that meme it get what they were trying to do with that one.
Absolutely. It's just such a ridiculous... It's like one of my clickbait titles, except that Apple's using it in an ad, which I find very hilarious.
We're jumping ahead massively now, but like I assume you have seen the ad of the Magic Keyboard on iPad Pro.
Oh.
They have basically...
Oh, we're going to go here.
They've done it again, right? Which I thought was very clever, right? Like that they have actually given that line, like, what is a computer, the treatment it deserves, I think, this time.
Yes. Okay, so hang on. So before we dive deep into iPad land, I'm curious, Mike, what devices do you use daily right now?
All right, so I think we should focus on, because there's like a whole big other question of like my iMac Pro and all that sort of stuff. Portable computers, right? Like I think that is... Because that's kind of what we're looking at, is like, what is a laptop? Looking at the current state of laptop, right? Like computers you can put on your lap and use, right? So I have been an iPad Pro user for work for 5 years.
Wait, has it been 5 years?
The iPad Pro came out in 2015.
Ooh, damn.
Right, because it's kind of fun, really. I was talking about this on another show that I do, Connected, this week, because we have just passed the iPad's 10th anniversary of shipping to customers. So it shipped in April.
Wait, Mike, are you trying to tell me right now that the iPad Pro has been out for the same length of time as the iPad had been when the Pro came out?
Exactly.
Whoa.
Isn't that crazy?
I feel the iPad Pro just came out.
So we went from 2010 to 2015, and now we've come from 2015 to 2020, and in 2020, we're getting trackpad and weird keyboards.
Oh,
so I think
finally.
It's kind of like every 5 years we've hit one of these big points. We went from iPad, what it was, right, as like this consumption device that you can do some work on if you want to know this is a serious computer, to where we are now, which is, I think trackpad support in general will change a lot of people's opinions about the iPad, and especially about the iPad Pro and the Magic Keyboard. But anyway, so I've been using an iPad Pro, the 12.9-inch iPad Pro,
the big
as
boy,
my main computer for 5 years. I'm a big fan of iPad OS in general. I enjoy the usability. I've been a Mac user for 15 years, 16 years, maybe a little bit longer than that. So, like, I'm not, like, you know, a lot of people now are turning to iOS because it's like, this is just the computer I grew up with or whatever, right? But, like, I've been a long time Mac user, like, half of my life at this point. But iOS and iPad OS just kind of fits really well with the way that I work. So more focused environments, right? There's less on a screen at once, which is like less distraction. I don't think of the iPad like some people do as like a one app device, but you can only ever have 3 at one time, right? Like, there's only so much you can have breaking in on you. There is less inherent complexity to the iPad than there is to a Mac. Like, to be a power user of the iPad, I feel is easier than to be a power user of the Mac. And it really does feel like in some ways that gap is widening. My favorite reason that I love iPad OS is feature-rich modern applications. Like, application development on iOS and iPad OS is the best in the world, in my opinion. It's better than any other platform.
Mike, are you trying to tell me that my poorly built web app of Twitter for Windows is not the pinnacle of modern engineering?
I'm afraid to say. I mean, I've used the Twitter app now on every platform, and it is best on iOS. I totally agree. There are arguments to be made for functionality reasons, right? Like, oh, you can do this on Windows, or you can do this on the Mac, or you can do this on Android because of different APIs and stuff. But I feel that like for a consistency of experience, for an ease of use perspective, and for the most interesting things that are going on, I find iOS and iPadOS to have that. So that's kind of why I like iPadOS. But then when it comes to the iPad itself, I really love the form factor, right? Because of its flexibility. So I use my iPad Pro in one of three modes, which is either as a straight up tablet, right? So there's just, I've got the tablet. I always have the Apple Pencil there too. So I use the Apple Pencil,
Right.
not just for note taking, but sometimes to actually just scroll and tap and snap. I've done that for years, and I find that to be a very comfortable way to use the iPad. So again, also in its flexibility, even in tablet mode, sometimes I use my finger, sometimes I use the Apple Pencil. Or I use the tablet with an attached keyboard. I've been a fan of the Bridge keyboards for a while for that.
I can't use an iPad without a keyboard. Like
I get
legitimately, I'm so used to it. I'm so used to it. Like that feels like the way an iPad is meant to be used to me.
If I do not have it in my fixed setup, which I'll talk about in a second, most of the time I will have it with a keyboard. You know, it's the Bridge now, but I've also always enjoyed the Smart Keyboard Folios as well. But I like the Bridge keyboard because it basically makes it like a laptop. Most of the time when I'm using my iPad Pro, I use it in a stand so it can be elevated to my height, and I plug in a keyboard and use a trackpad. So I basically use it like a fixed computer at a nice desk with my nice chair, and it's just because I love using iPadOS so much that I'm able to enjoy the flexibility of use case that this computer provides. These types of things, and I get it, blow people's minds how someone could use an iPad in this way.
You've got the iMac Pro in the background, like collecting dust, and you're like on your iPad at the desk.
When I am using my iPad at that desk, behind me is my iMac Pro. Literally
of
behind
course.
me.
You don't even want to look at it.
No, well, it's not that. It's just I have two different desks in my office for that. But so that's like how I will use my iPad the most. It's because I like to be able to, and throughout the day, I will very frequently use my iPad in all of those modes.
That's cool.
But I want to have the consistency, right? I could move to my Mac for certain things in a day, but then I'm changing modes, I'm changing apps. It's not all available to me the way that I want. So I like to have that flexibility. So that's the majority, and we're going to talk in a little bit about like what we're doing on those devices, kind of from a like nuts and bolts level. But I also have a MacBook Pro, which I use for podcasting on the road, because I don't record on my iPad. I record everything on my iMac Pro, but if I'm traveling, I will use a MacBook Pro for that.
Okay, so I don't have anywhere near as cool of an explanation for my things. So you're out here like waxing poetic about the abilities of iPad.
Austin, because what you're going to say is fine, but when I say I use an iPad Pro for all of my work and I use it in a stand, I have to explain it all, because otherwise there are people that just can't get it because they've never used an iPad that way, you know?
So on my side, it is not as exciting. So I currently use a Dell XPS 13 2-in-1. Although, and I'll get into this in a little bit, the iPad actually has been replacing that for me somewhat, but it's a little complicated. But essentially, my history is I've definitely bounced back and forth between Mac OS and Windows pretty much consistently the last decade or so. And for the last like 4 or 5 years, I was more in the Mac OS camp, like especially when it came to like MacBooks. Like I used to carry around like an 11-inch Air all the time, and then I switched over to a 13-inch Pro, and then finally a 15, and obviously now the 16-inch Pro. But the thing is for me is that Mac OS has been how should I put this? Maybe not the fastest moving, and in fact, I would argue maybe some sort of backward steps recently with some certain updates. Whereas on the Windows side, I feel like it has consistently gotten better and faster and smoother, and specifically with the hardware, which used to be one of the main reasons why I used a Mac. The hardware on a lot of Windows computers is, I would argue, better than pretty much any MacBook.
Right, because you can make the same argument that for a period of time, and I think Apple's moving out of that time period now personally, but for a period of time, they really took the foot off the gas of Mac hardware as well.
Absolutely, right? So like with the XPS, I love having a touchscreen, right? Like it's hard for me to use a Windows laptop without a touchscreen. I'm so used to it, and especially with the 2-in-1, I can easily like flip it around. And also you have the nice keyboard, the solid trackpad, especially for a Windows computer. You still have a couple of Thunderbolt ports. I personally really like the XPS. However, I will say now that we do have the 2020 iPad, and especially now that we have the trackpad support, I have been moving a lot of my sort of mobile day-to-day tasks over to the iPad.
Okay.
And also what's been really helpful is I finally own an iPad. For the first time, actually, I think in my entire life, I own an iPad with LTE. And Mike, I have been missing out. It is so nice to
big
just
deal.
have it always connected.
Yep.
I'm just like...
Tethering is easy, but it is not as easy as having a cell chip built in, right?
Absolutely, right? I don't have to worry about my phone battery dying. I don't have to worry about the flakiness if sometimes the tether decides not to work. I always have my iPad there and connected, right? And that's the thing with the XPS. Like when I'm going out and about, I'm tethering with the XPS all the time, but that's even more clunky, right? I'm like going into my phone, turning it on, like back and forth. Whereas the iPad, I pull it out and it's just ready.
Yeah, so I don't have a cell on my 12.9-inch iPad because I also have an 11-inch iPad, which is the iPad I use when I'm not at home. So if I am traveling, if I'm going to be, when we used to do this, work outside of the home for a period of time, I would have my 11-inch iPad with me. And just as a quick aside, the 11-inch iPad is the iPad that like 85% of people should buy, right? Like, you should only get the 12.9 if there is a reason you already know you want the bigger screen.
Yep.
If you do not have a good reason for that, you should get the 11, because since they went from like 9.7 to 10.5 and now to 11 inches, 11 to 12.9, there is not actually that much difference in usability in most tasks, but the 11 feels so much more portable than the 12.9.
Look, I am a big fan of small phones, and I've always been a big fan of smaller iPads. I used to love the iPad Mini.
The Mini was it, man.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like that was like my favorite thing, especially when you had like the little like the folding like cover.
Smart cover? Yeah.
Yeah, the smart cover, dude. Like that was like my setup. But then as soon as the 9.7-inch iPad Pro came out, that was actually the first time, I guess 5 years ago now, that was the first time I had really seriously considered moving a lot of my work over to an iPad. And in fact, I've actually done a couple videos over the years of like trying to switch to iPad. And while that first iPad Pro, I couldn't do it, like it was cool and the keyboard made the iPad actually viable, but it still was, you know, early days, especially for me who was kind of still honestly kind of in the Windows and the Mac camp at the time. But nowadays with iPad OS and with this iPad Pro with the incredible screen and everything, I found that I'm actually starting to lean a little bit more toward using the iPad. I mean, I'm even like, so one of the things that's always been a challenge for me, and specifically trying to use the iPad, is dealing with files, right? So I have a lot of video files and audio files, and we're connecting to servers, and I'm bouncing stuff back and forth. And before, it was a nightmare to try to use an iPad.
It was impossible until
couldn't do it.
Until about a year or two ago. It was effectively impossible to do it unless you really knew what you were doing.
Exactly. But now I can actually take my iPad. If I'm going into work, I can go into the office with just my iPad. I can transfer files. Sure, it doesn't work with everything. So for example, if we're trying to dump like a red mag, right, which is obviously not something which is super normal, the iPad either can't power it or it doesn't work. So some things certainly aren't completely feasible. But for the most part, I can easily screen record. I can actually capture content on the iPad. I can actually really take advantage of being able to jump on the server and pull a file down or upload something or move things around, which is something I do pretty much on a daily basis, especially given how much I've been at home recently. So the iPad has definitely been coming up. But I do take advantage of a 16-inch MacBook Pro. But honestly, Mike, that's like my desktop.
Yeah, I've seen you using it. It's you use the 16-inch MacBook Pro as a desktop replacement, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That thing, it obviously comes with me when I travel and when I'm like editing on the go.
So when you're traveling to events and stuff, you have your machine.
Exactly. So for the same reason that you like to use your iPad as you kind of go between different spaces in your office, it's the same thing for me. Obviously, there are many ways to sync files across and keep things up to date, but it's always a hassle when you have multiple devices that all need to be updated, that all need to, you need to do this, you need to do that. Whereas when I have like my edit machine that is at my desk. I can plug it in and is plenty powerful to handle whatever edits I do, which to be fair, I don't edit as much as I used to. And then all I need to do is unplug it, put it in my backpack, jump on a plane, and I'm still completely up and running wherever I go.
Yeah, once I'm back in my studio, that's a route that I'm going to be taking with my recording machine. So I'm going to still use my iMac Pro for editing, but for when I'm recording podcasts, I'm going to use a different, more sound-isolated desk where I will record onto a laptop. I'm still deciding which Mac laptop I'm going to get, but then that will be the same machine that I take with me when I travel, so it's all set up for recording, and it's just like all the settings are exact as they need to be.
Yeah, it's one of those things where when you're doing like recording or editing, or when you're doing any of this kind of creative work, the last thing you want to do is when you sit down to do an edit or something is spend 10 minutes updating and resetting up your keyboard shortcuts because you changed something on the other system. And
well, yeah, if you've been doing this kind of creative work for a long time, your process is built on the top of lots of little tweaks that you've done over time, and trying to trace those back is almost impossible to do.
Yeah, it's crazy. So that's why the 16-inch, and honestly, the 16-inch is powerful enough. I don't really find any downside to using it as a desktop, because honestly, it's like my dual screen setup. I have it plugged into a 5K ultrafine, but the MacBook display is my secondary display. And while I do have a mouse, I actually really frequently bounce between the mouse and the trackpad based on what I'm doing. So it just kind of simplifies the entire setup for me. So that's kind of my general portable setup.
This episode of The Test Drivers is brought to you by FreshBooks. Our friends at FreshBooks can help you save time with their super simple cloud accounting software. By simplifying tasks like invoicing, expense tracking, and getting paid online, FreshBooks has drastically reduced the time it takes for over 10 million people to deal with their paperwork. One of the things that I love about FreshBooks is it gives me peace of mind of what's going on in my business. FreshBooks will automate late payment email reminders for me, so I spend less time chasing payments and more time doing what I do. And when you email a client an invoice, FreshBooks can show you whether they've seen it, which puts an end to those guessing games and the need to chase people to make sure that they pay you. If you're listening to this and not yet using FreshBooks, now is the time to try it out. They are offering an unrestricted 30-day free trial for listeners of this show with no credit card required. All you have to do is go to freshbooks.com/testdrivers, and when they say, "How did you hear about us?" just say, "On the Test Drivers." I've been using FreshBooks for years now, and I am such a fan of how easy it makes it for me to be able to send invoices to my clients. That gives me the peace of mind that I need with my business. Go to freshbooks.com/testdrivers right now for a 30-day free trial. Our thanks to FreshBooks for their support of this show and Relay FM. So we've spoken about like the edge case devices, right? But the actual devices that we're using daily, which for me are the iPad Pro, and for you, I think, is a mix between the XPS and the iPad.
Yes.
Let's go through what we're doing on these. So I want to kind of, when I say I work from my iPad, I want to give people an example of that. Like, what is that actually looking like? So everything that I do, which is not podcast recording and editing, is done from an iPad. And you may think to yourself, but Mike, you are a podcaster. What else is there for you to do? Right? A lot of my work time is obviously not recording because I run the business, right? Like I'm part of running Relay FM, like the network that this is a part of. So that includes like all general work tasks, right? The types of tasks that many of our listeners will do every day. So like all of my email is done through my iPad. So like iMessage and Slack and stuff like that, right? So communication, personal and business, I do that all from my iPad. Research for shows and the writing of all of our show documents and stuff. Like I take lots of notes before we record so I can refer to stuff. I do all of that on my iPad, including reading news. Like I read a lot of tech news to make sure I'm understanding what I want to be talking about. All the social media stuff is done there. I deal with lots of spreadsheets. Oh boy, lots of spreadsheets and contracts and stuff like that. Like I do all of those types of things on my iPad. One of the reasons I love to deal with contracts is because I can sign them with my Apple Pencil.
Yes,
right?
That is so nice, man.
So I've run all of the day-to-day of running a small business is done from my iPad, like tax-related stuff, right? Like this was great. Like a couple of days ago with the changes that they made of iOS 13, like my accountant needed a bunch of PDFs, And it's so much easier now with the download manager to deal with that. Like I can just
Yeah.
click the download buttons and actually download the files, which you could not do before iOS 13. You had to like open the PDF and then save. Like it was crazy.
Well, that's the thing. I feel like so many people are so skeptical when you say, "Hey, I use an iPad to do these things." But so many people are used to using an iPad for, watching Netflix and like, "Oh, I'm trying to
Yep.
download a file. Oh, I can't. This is a joke." And they never really kind of think about it again. Whereas it really has come so far.
And they're continuing to work on it, right? So the trackpad support that's in iOS 13.4, right, which allows you to hook up a mouse or a trackpad to an iPad, I think is going to be able to allow a lot more people to look at this again, because it really does help you feel like you're using a regular computer. And then I think that's going to change a lot of people's mindsets. So they're not going to be so hung up on like, oh, but this can't be a computer. This is a toy.
Right.
Because iPadOS is getting so powerful now that being able to put a pointer on the thing, I think will help it like a little bit more sense to people as to what kind of device they're sitting down in front of.
Absolutely. The keyboard for me was the big
Yeah.
thing that moved the iPad from
Yep.
a consumption device to something that you can
Definitely.
actually create on. But now that we've come so far with, adding a trackpad and the ability to do such much, like, I don't want to say multitasking is perfect. I still do like the Mac OS, the Windows style of being able to have freeform window management. But that being said, given the way that iOS apps are developed, I can't be too upset. Like, it doesn't bother me that much the way that multitasking is being done. But Mike, you threw the word out, toy. I'm curious, the one thing you don't do on the iPad is do podcast recording. I know it's technically possible, but
Yeah.
I'm curious, what's sort of the reasoning behind why you don't, or have you even, I'm sure you've experimented with it, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is doable. I know people that do it. Like, I have co-hosts that on occasion will record from their iPads, but to get it done in a way that I am comfortable with, so to have some redundancy built in,
Yes,
you need to
yes.
use like multiple devices, like hardware devices, in a way that I'm not happy with. And basically, the main problem is on a Mac, developers have ability to grab system audio in and out, right? So as we're talking right now, me and Austin are talking over Skype, but I am recording my audio locally in 2 separate applications. Now, you can't do this on an iPad. You cannot use other applications to record the audio that you are sending and receiving. So if me and Austin were doing this right now, really, we'd have to be using some application that I'm not used to using, right? Or I would have to be using, and this is the way that most people will do it, a device like a Zoom recorder, which is
Yes.
also recording my audio. And that's fine-ish if you set it up properly, but like there is no upside to me for doing this right now, because
Yes.
I would be disrupting too heavily the content that I'm creating. It's the same reason for why I'm not currently editing shows on an iPad. Like, there are apps to do it. There are many people that use this software to do it. It's like an app called Ferrite, which is really great, like really great. But I just don't want to learn a new application right now.
Absolutely. And that's the same thing for me when it comes to using the iPad as a video editing tool, right? So there are many apps that are quite impressive when it comes to editing, but I know how to use Final Cut. I've used Final Cut for years. I don't want to throw away all of that experience to try to learn a new application, especially considering that so much of the footage we use isn't just a thing that it doesn't work well on iPad. It doesn't work on iPad, period, full stop. I cannot get Red Code to work on iPad. I cannot use DaVinci Resolve to color things on an iPad. Like, there are things that I could do to make the iPad a usable thing. And if I had to, there's certainly footage that I could shoot, import, edit, and upload from the iPad. It's possible. But it's the same kind of thing, right? It's not quite to that point. And until, Tim gives us that sweet macOS download link for iPad, it's not going to happen. Can we talk about that or no? Is that allowed? Can we talk about macOS on iPad, or are you going to cut that off?
No. We can. Okay, so like, it is not outside of the realm of possibility. So we're going to talk about ARM a little bit later on in this episode.
Yeah.
And one of my co-hosts, Jason Snow, has been working on a conspiracy theory, which I subscribe to and enjoy for a bit, that if Apple are going to announce an ARM transition, so they're moving from Intel to ARM on their laptop line of macOS, they're going to in theory, need to provide developers with a testing environment. And wouldn't it be great if the 2020 iPad could run a version of macOS distributed from Apple to allow people to test macOS and their apps on ARM?
I support this theory so hard. Like, dude, I'm so about it. The second I saw that keyboard with the trackpad, I'm like, yo, wait a minute.
It's not an impossible situation, especially when when you benchmark a 2020 iPad Pro, it beats every laptop that Apple make. So, it's not outside of the realm of possibility.
Oh god. Okay, you know what? We got to change subject because I get so excited by the idea of Mac OS running on an iPad, and I know I shouldn't because it's dumb, and I'm sure that they'll bring out a new MacBook Air and it'll run the Apple chip or whatever.
As soon as they put ARM in a laptop, that idea will die for you because you'll get everything you want and more, right? Like it's gonna last. Those batteries are gonna last for like 17 hours.
Yep.
The designs are going to be crazy cool, right? Like
built-in 5G.
Yeah, it's going to be a very, very different experience, and you'll get everything. You'll get most of what you want without a touchscreen. Because I think if they did do this, like macOS ARM on an iPad, I don't think it will work with touch at all.
I'm 50-50 on that one. I feel like this would be the time if they're sort of making a big play. Obviously, it seems like this ARM transition has been coming for the Mac for years and years and years. If they're going to make a big play and they're going to change a bunch of things, this would be the time that they could incorporate touch.
We are going to have to agree to disagree on this. I think Apple are drawing their line in the sand harder than ever about where touch exists on their product lines. And I believe there will be a time in the future where Apple make what we think of as Macs right now with touchscreens, but I don't think it's yet.
I'll give you that one. I would like to see it, but
I would
also,
like to see it too.
I mean, I come from the side where like Windows legitimately does a pretty good job with touch. It's certainly not perfect, but when you treat it as a trackpad mouse operating system first with touch as like an easy way to scroll or to do minor things, it works pretty well. And I feel like that might not be the Apple way, but I would really love to see touch on a laptop, even for just the simplest use cases if I want to pinch to zoom a photo or something like that. But that's fine. If they give me an iPad that I can download macOS to that the touchscreen doesn't work, that's fine. That's fine. I just want this in my life. But you know what else I want in my life, Mike? I want to be able to edit on my iPad.
Oh, you do want to?
I do. Okay, so that's the thing. Like, what gets me so excited about macOS on an iPad is the idea that I would be able to use a full version of macOS, like ideally. And I'm going way into crazy town here. I could dual boot macOS, so I could literally do everything on my iPad. I could switch over to macOS, import all my red footage, cut it all in Final Cut, do whatever I need to do, then jump back out to iPadOS and use it and have a wonderful, blissful life and use everything on one device. That's my dream setup. That is absolutely my dream setup. But I don't think that's going to happen.
So here's the thing. I think it is incredibly possible that at some point in the not too distant future, that Apple will make Final Cut for iPadOS.
Ooh. See, I kind of feel like that. Why would they continue to make macOS if they bring all of their pro apps over to iPadOS? Like at that point, why don't they just merge the two, right? Like I don't understand why they would put all this work.
Well,
really?
So I think that it doesn't have to be the full version, right? It could be a version which will work with your Final Cut Pro files and will allow you to do a bunch of stuff, but maybe you can't like color grade in it, right?
Like Final Cut Express.
Yeah, but I do think that there is... Okay, so one important part of this is, are you familiar with Apple's universal purchase model now?
Yes.
So Apple have recently included the Mac in the universal purchase, right? So you can now make an app which can either be made with Apple's Catalyst framework, which is like iPadOS on the Mac, or with Apple's regular development frameworks like AppKit, and include that in a bundle purchase of an iOS app.
Which is brilliant. It's the way it should be done.
There are arguments on both sides, but for the regular consumer, that's what people want, right? I can see stuff like that combined with Apple trying to show, and they are trying to convince other people that the iPad is a professional tool, that they should be putting their money where their mouth is and make versions of their Pro apps for iPadOS.
I feel like I really want to see what happens when they announce this ARM transition, right? I think it's going to be very telling which way they're going to go, because obviously they're not going to go through all this work to move macOS over to ARM processors for no reason, right? And obviously they're incredibly quickly iterating on iPadOS and adding these features, which really are bringing it so much closer to what macOS can do.
Well, you said for no reason.
Ooh.
I see why you would say for no reason, but you need to think from Apple's perspective. Apple very much care about their hardware and the performance of their hardware with their software.
Right.
And Intel is not delivering for them and hasn't for a long time.
Oh, we could talk about that. In fact, I feel like we were going to talk about that later in the show anyway. Yeah, no, that's absolutely the case. And while we can see that Intel has had a rough few years, I mean, even AMD has caught up, which is something I never thought I would say. Mm-hmm. But if you put that aside, what Apple's been able to do, and honestly, what the entire ARM ecosystem has been able to do, is iterate very quickly, right? Like we're seeing 20, 30, 40, 50% gains year over year. Whereas for a very long time on the desktop, Intel has been like, oh, here's a couple percent here, here's a few percent there. Even AMD, who had these massive catch-ups, still has not been able to keep that up, right? Like at this rate, the mobile processors of the world are very, very quickly catching the traditional laptop and even kind of getting closer to what we expect to see out of like a traditional desktop. So it makes perfect sense for me for Apple to move their chips, which are already basically the best of the world, right? I mean, no one can really touch the CPU, and the GPU is a little bit tougher sometimes, but generally speaking, the overall performance of what Apple has been creating. Mm-hmm. But this just feels like it's such a huge moment for them as iPadOS is ascending and as they have this huge reset switch that they can throw for macOS of which direction they really want to push things. Is it just literally, hey, all those Intel processors you have, we're just going to swap that out with ARM, the end?
Well, so are you familiar with Apple's Swift UI that they introduced last year? So Swift UI is like a next generation way of building applications where I don't want to get into the weeds of it too much, but effectively it will become much easier for a developer to write some amount of code once and it work on all of Apple's platforms. I think that what they want to do is unify their hardware, right? So and then what the OSs are running on, and then also unify application development for some developers if they want to opt into the SwiftUI world or the Mac Catalyst world, but keep the operating systems distinctly different for now. And this isn't necessary. If I was in charge of Apple, this is not the route that I would take. Personally, I would want to build a next generation operating system that unified the best of both. That's what I would want to do because I think that makes sense. But I think what Apple want to do is effectively try and unify as much as possible without changing the underlying operating system, which is curious, but I think they don't want to Windows 8 everything, right?
Yeah.
I think they do not want to alienate either customer base too much, too fast.
There's so much legacy support in macOS with all of these apps that have been around for decades, all the stuff that's built in, which is legitimately great. I mean, we were just talking just
less and less all the time because they keep cutting stuff out. But yes, it is a good point that you're making.
But I mean, look, the Mac still has the ability to download an app from anywhere and just run it, right? The iPad is not, and probably will never have that, right?
Never.
There are so many things. We were talking earlier about, you can't record podcasts on iPadOS because you can't easily split out multiple audio sources. Mm-hmm. Sure, could they add that? Absolutely. But they're adding trackpad support first, right? There are so many things down the list before that is sort of like a priority for them, whereas macOS has had this built in forever. So I definitely think for the next few years or whatever, it totally makes sense. But I just look, if you're Apple and you're spending all this money to develop iPadOS and macOS and iOS, does it make sense for you to continue to develop all three of these separately for so long when specifically iPadOS has really been bridging the gap between iOS and macOS for a while? To me, that doesn't seem like it can be a really sustainable long-term decision, as the iPad really has nowhere to go but to eat into the Mac's slice of the pie, I guess.
This episode is brought to you by SaneBox. Getting your inbox to zero feels like an impossible task. We all get tons of email, and sometimes the important stuff, the emails that really matter, can get lost. And that's where SaneBox comes in. As messages arrive, SaneBox triages them for you, sorting the important emails from the noise. It will put what matters to you most in your inbox, and all of the distracting stuff will go into your Sane Later folder, which lets you deal with what's important right now and to review everything when it suits you. SaneBox also has nifty features like the Sane Black Hole, where you can drag messages from annoying senders and you'll never hear from them again, and Sane Reminders to help notify you if somebody hasn't replied to your email by a certain date. Best of all, you can use SaneBox with any email client or phone, and it will work wherever you check your email. One of my favorite features is the Sane News folder, which will automatically take email newsletters and bundle them up and put them into a folder. This is great for a couple of reasons. One, I feel like I'm constantly getting a barrage of marketing email, and some of it I want to see, some of it I don't, but I don't need it all in my inbox. So it's really great to have it filtered out so I can get to it when I want to, and that's the same for email newsletters that I've chosen to subscribe to. It all gets put into my Sane News folder, and I can go in and deal with it on my own terms. See how SaneBox can work its magic to remove distractions from your inbox by getting a free 2-week trial right now. Go to sanebox.com/testdrivers today to start your free trial and also get a $25 credit. That's sanebox.com/testdrivers. Our thanks to SaneBox for their support of this show and all of Relay FM. Can we talk a little bit about the mobile chip landscape?
Oh, yes, we can.
As to why Apple might even want to consider changing their situation. So, we've spoken about ARM. ARM is the architecture that Apple builds their own chips, like the chips that go into iPhones, the chips that go into iPads, and all of the other products that Apple make. And Apple are able to design them themselves, and then they get them fabricated by companies that they either own or part own or have great relationships with, right? That's kind of the way that they will do their business. They make their entire system on a chip that way. And because Apple design it, they can design software to take advantage of it, or they can build hardware to take advantage of the software. It's wonderful for them, right? They can optimize the heck out of everything because it's theirs. It's their own integrated system.
Yes.
But every other computer in the world, by and large, actually, I think every other computer in the world, including smartphones, it's not as simple as that.
Samsung are the closest because Samsung does have the foundry, they have the actual people who are designing the chip, and they have the phones, but they've fallen behind Qualcomm, right? For example, with the Galaxy S20, the Qualcomm Snapdragon option is the better option, full stop, right?
Well, but even then, they can't ever push the Exynos chip too far because then you end up with different performing phones in different regions, which doesn't make any sense, right?
Well, but the thing is, they kind of do right now, except it's
really?
the opposite. The Exynos doesn't perform as well, so when you get the Exynos option, it's not as good as the Snapdragon, right? And this definitely varies based on each year, but...
It's like they can't, but sometimes they can't help it.
They do. Exactly. But no, so I think Apple is in a really unique position. Like you said, they own the entire experience end to end, which is crazy, right? So if you look at the difference between the iPad and the Mac right now, one of the big differences is that Apple, for new hardware, is largely tied to Intel's release cycle, right?
Yep.
And Intel, very famously over the last, it's probably been 4 or 5 years now at this point, has had serious issues with keeping on their roadmaps, right? So they used to have this thing called Tick-Tock, which essentially meant that you would 1 year bring out a new architecture, bring out a bunch more performance, then the next year you would take that architecture and shrink it down to a smaller process node. And obviously the smaller process node, you can fit more transistors. That has traditionally been the way that we get performance, right? And Intel did that very successfully for many years and absolutely destroyed all of the competition, right? Like it wasn't even close. However, as you shrink that process node smaller and smaller, it gets more difficult. And Intel has run into real issues with, they had planned on, here's, our next architecture. Oh, wait, but the process isn't ready. We'll just revise the old one and do it again and again and again. And while you can definitely continue to optimize what you've already built, there is certainly a law of diminishing returns there. And essentially, Intel has fallen multiple years behind where they thought they would be right now. Whereas when you look over on the Apple, and especially with the ARM side of the camp, they have been much less coupled because essentially Intel do everything, right? They design the chips, they fab them themselves. Like it's all in-house. Whereas if Apple is, say, going out to a fab such as like TSMC, who have been making the chips inside iPads and iPhones for a little while, they can partner with them, say, hey, what do you have? Oh, this new process? Sweet, we'll take it. But if it's not coming along or whatever, they can go, oh, you know what? Never mind. We're going to go over and talk to someone else, right? Like there are, mind you, not a lot of these foundries anymore, but there are still some options. And Apple has the ability to take advantage of whatever the best technology is at the time. And they're also not tied to Intel being like, oops, this year we couldn't bring it out, so we're just going to rev the last year's chip. Whereas they know exactly what's going on because they have the foundry team. They have everything that's sort of in-house where they can exactly build the products that they want when they want to. And also it's a lot cheaper because, fun fact, when you are the Intels and, to be fair, AMDs of the world, you get to charge whatever you want because good luck trying to replace yourself. Whereas Apple, they know exactly what their chips cost. They don't need to make a profit because that's just built into the device. So there are many reasons why it makes sense for Apple to switch away from the Intels of the world to move over to their own chips.
So this is the fun part of it, right? Where it's like you've actually got two arguments here. There is an argument for one, Apple to switch to their own processor, but then there's argument two, which is Apple to switch away from Intel.
Yes.
And in the past, that has been one argument. But I think now we're in the camp of it being two arguments where...
Absolutely.
And there has been lots of rumors. There's been code discovered of Apple internally developing seriously to run macOS on AMD systems.
It's really interesting. So our good friend Quinn Nelson from the wonderful podcast Flashback, as well as, of course, YouTube, but whatever. I like to plug his podcast.
Who cares about YouTubers, am I right?
So Quinn does a lot of Hackintosh content. That's not something that I've done a couple of Hackintoshes, but he gets way more into that. And I was having a conversation with him not too long ago, and he's like, I can't believe how easy it is to Hackintosh with AMD, with specifically their Ryzen systems. Like in the past, you could Hackintosh on an AMD system. But the problem is that because macOS is designed for Intel, it was a bit of a disaster, right? Like it used to be incredibly difficult. It wouldn't work as well. You would have all kinds of issues. However, now, according to Quinn at least, it's as easy, if not maybe even easier, to Hackintosh on AMD versus Intel. Now, it's not exactly a one-to-one comparison. I mean, obviously, Intel and AMD are not really like the ability to Hackintosh sometimes comes down to the way that things are designed and how much time, developers are putting into actually making these Hackintosh sort of patches and everything work. But that being said, there's, like you said, very, very good evidence that Apple at the very least has considered getting macOS up and running on AMD chips. And it's hard to say because to me, it doesn't make a ton of sense why they would switch. Like, there's been so many rumors and there's so much talk about them switching over to their own processors. Well, I'm sure it's it's 10% as much work to switch to AMD versus switching everything over to ARM, which is a completely different instruction set. But there's enough smoke here. There's some fire somewhere, right?
Well, because even an ARM transition, it is going to be many years before Apple moves its Pro computers, right?
It has to be. So that's the thing. When we talk about performance of these ARM chips, right? Like the iPad is incredibly powerful compared to most thin and light Windows laptops. What it is not as powerful as is a desktop chip. What it is not powerful as is a desktop or even a laptop like Series GPU, right? It can't compete yet. Now, if you want, you can speculate in your mind of what if Apple throws in a bunch of these chips? What if they put in, a dual processor unit, or what if they just build a giant ARM chip inside a desktop?
Yep.
Sure, that's possible. But the problem is that part of the reason that ARM processors have been able to get so many gains so quickly is because they're so focused on the lower power. When you start sort of cranking up, you might get 80% of the performance at 30% of the power. If you want to go to 85% of the performance, you might need 50% of the max power, right? Like the curve gets incredibly steep as you try to get that last little bit of performance. And it causes real issues when you're trying to push something to desktop levels of performance, right? That high level of performance is very difficult and very expensive and very power consuming to sort of reach. So it's not an entirely fair comparison to look at how a mobile device can compare to a desktop until we actually see Apple develop this stuff. They could, but it gets very difficult to imagine, like you said, the Pro systems with
we
the
just haven't
graphics and
seen
everything.
it yet, right? And we could be a way away from seeing it. Now, I think it would be not ambitious to imagine Apple changing over all of the laptops Well, I should say the MacBook Air and the iMac within a year or two. And then maybe a couple of years later, well, maybe a year after that, they could maybe come up with an option for the Pro laptops. But looking at the iMac Pro and the Mac Pro, that's going to be a longer period of time unless Apple has something up their sleeves that nobody's seen before.
I can believe, and so there are ARM chips that are very big and power hungry, right? Like, so for example, some servers run ARM chips right now, right? And generally the idea is that you have lots of small cores versus, fewer big Intel or AMD cores. So it is very possible that if Apple wanted to, they could take a A15X or whatever they want to call it, probably something totally different, but they take one of their current processors and just double or triple the amount of cores, right? Like that's not a ridiculous thing to put into something like, say, like an iMac or even like a Mac Pro. But the issue is that while they can scale their CPUs up, I assume reasonably easily, there are certainly limits and you can't just scale forever because then you start running into other issues. But I feel that they could go quite a bit larger. But the graphics, I think, are a significantly bigger bottleneck. And I don't see, while they could probably push that CPU within a couple years, like that wouldn't surprise me. But the graphics, I don't think that they're going to have integrated graphics that are anywhere near as powerful as the NVIDIAs and the AMDs of the world, which means that to me, if they really wanted to push it into the pro market, they need to build these ARM chips that can actually work with the standard AMD and the or the NVIDIA graphics of the world. There's no way that they can get around it.
They need to partner with one of those companies and work on a joint solution, right?
Yes.
But the other thing that we've not even mentioned is software, right? Like, and so we were talking about why Apple might want to have a development kit, because they need developers to recompile their applications and tweak their applications to run on this new architecture, the same way as when Apple moved from PowerPC to Intel, 16 or 17 years ago. So, and it is known, or it is obvious that the more complicated an application, the more work it takes, and the people that use the most complicated applications are typically the professional customers.
Yes.
So, you can look at Adobe and you can see what they're doing in Photoshop, right? You can look at it and be like, they are preparing for a different world, right? By bringing Photoshop for the iPad and building it up again, right? And Adobe have spoken at length about wanting to have the same application running on all devices. It is to prepare for this future world, right? Of different processors that need similar looking applications. But so all of that stuff is to say, we are a period of time away, which is longer from the ARM transition that Apple will make, to all of their computers running on ARM chips. So in a time when Apple was making lots of big decisions, a decision that they could make is to offer a new choice for processors.
Ooh.
And that choice could be AMD. And one of the reasons they might want to do this is because they could get significant gains, it looks like right now, especially at the high end, either on laptop or desktop, by switching to AMD. Can you, Austin, talk a little bit about the Ryzen Mobile 4000?
Oh, boy, can I. So, Ryzen... So, actually, let's take a little step back here.
Yeah, okay.
Because I feel like we have to set the stage. AMD, in the not-too-distant past, was almost out of business, right? Like, we're talking 2013, 2014. They were in rough shape.
Because Intel destroyed them with the core processors, right?
Yes, and it also was helped that AMD, who is, to be fair, always been a far smaller company, right? But AMD developed a core back, it was like 2011, 2012, that was a terrible idea. They tried to go multi-threaded. AMD's had 8-core processors around for quite a while, but they were bad. Like, they just were not remotely competitive, right? So there was a period of time where AMD was very much in deep, deep trouble. So they essentially threw a Hail Mary, and they were like, look, we're going to build this brand new core called Zen. It's going to be we're betting the company on it. And they literally, as far as I'm aware, they pretty much bet the company on Ryzen being successful. And it turned out that not only has Ryzen been wildly successful over the last few years, but at the exact same time, Intel stumbled harder than they have pretty much in their entire lives, right? Like, if you could go back and you could talk to time-traveled Austin from 7 years ago and explain where we are today in 2020, I would not have believed it. It is just such an unbelievable level of luck and unfortunate circumstances that has sort of leveled the tides. This just doesn't happen. So, with that being said, where we are today in 2020 is like this. On the server side, with the Zen 2 core, which goes into Ryzen 3/4. It depends on what you're talking about as far as the CPUs on the mobile and desktop and server space and everything. But essentially, the core inside, the CPU core, is the Zen 2 core. This core is dominant everywhere now. In servers, which is maybe not the most exciting thing for you and I to talk about, or maybe the audience, but servers are big business. Intel print money with servers, right? They print money on like $10,000 chips to go into Facebook servers that they buy by the tens of thousands, right? In servers, AMD is now a significant leader in the space. On the desktop, while Intel have very small leads in some places, specifically with gaming, so because they're able to run their chips so fast, even though as a whole, it might not be competitive in value in a couple of other areas, but at least Intel and AMD are somewhat competitive there. There are certainly some advantages to if you want the absolute maximum performance in like a game or something, you might want to go with an Intel chip. But besides that, when you look at price to performance, when you look at how many cores you get, when you look at streaming, all this kind of stuff, AMD has a very strong position. And that moves us to laptops. So Mike, have you ever used or even seen a laptop with an AMD processor in it?
No, I don't think so.
That makes sense because they sucked for
Yeah.
a very long time. There was a period in the mid-2000s where AMD laptops were mildly competitive, but that was, 15 years ago? And since then, while AMD has continued to build chips for laptops, they have been put in the cheapest, worst sort of systems that an OEM makes. Like if you go to the bargain bin of the local electronics store, in the past, that was pretty much where you would find a few AMD options. That was it. As soon as you got above like a few $100s, AMD was gone. You were all Intel. Intel owned that market. Now, when Ryzen came out, and specifically when Ryzen came to mobile, they started to see some inroads because while the first generation of Ryzen Mobile wasn't crazy competitive, it was better in some ways, like graphics were impressive, but it still wasn't quite as good as Intel, and Intel had spent so many years focusing on all of these things that are not just the CPU, right? With like the low wattage panels and optimizing battery life and Wi-Fi and all of these kind of things that they had just owned, right? Like they had just so thoroughly had that market. AMD had some catch up, right? So they got into it with Ryzen Mobile. Then the Ryzen Mobile 3000 series came out, which was a little bit better, but it still wasn't, it was kind of competitive, right? But then that brings us to today with Ryzen Mobile 4000 series, where they finally moved over the Zen 2 CPUs. So this is the most recent, the brand new thing. This is the same sort of chip that you will find, or rather the same CPU that you'll find in like the Xbox Series X, the PS5, obviously all of the servers and on Ryzen desktop. Like this is like as good as it gets right now. They've moved it over to laptops. Mike, it's really good. It's like it spanks Intel across the board, period.
Yep.
Which is a ridiculous thing to say, especially for laptops, where a few years ago, the AMD laptops you could buy were trash.
Yeah,
They've
I watched
completely
your
turned it around.
video and Linus's video, and the definite thing that came across from both of your videos on this was you were both very surprised at just how good because it's in the Asus ROG Zephyr. That's the first machine that's shipping with
The
these
Zephyrus
chips in.
G14.
Okay.
Yes. Well, actually, that's the first one we've seen because of the world situation. There are other laptops that will be shipping with this chip, and there's also a slightly lower wattage version, which will go in like Ultrabooks and stuff, but it's the same chip just based on, whatever the clock speed is. Yes, so this thing is nuts, right? So obviously, as a gaming laptop, this is really Intel's space to lose because they have thoroughly owned it, right? Like, if you had a couple of low-end AMD laptops, there were no AMD gaming laptops, like, period, right? So the fact is they've been able to go head to head with Intel, and honestly, they've just been able to win, right? So this new Ryzen 4000 mobile chip is more powerful, like in raw benchmarks across the board, than pretty much any Intel laptop out there, period. I know actually in the Linus video, he did this great comparison. He pulled out this giant Acer, which was like heavily overclocked, like huge, thick. It was ridiculous.
Massive
and it's
fans.
Still lost. It's still lost.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's still lost. But on top of that, while yes, performance is important, power, especially on a laptop, is really key. And AMD wins there too, right? AMD significantly wins there, right? Like this AMD chip pulls less power than even like a standard, not even counting like the crazy overclocked thing that was in the Intel chip. So yes, AMD is absolutely on top of their game right now. But the thing is, it's surprising because while they were competitive with the desktop side, it wasn't like a slam dunk, right? Like there was still like a lot of kind of back and forth. And based on the previous generation Ryzen stuff on laptops, it was good, but not great. So the fact is they leapfrogged so hard and they've completely blown away Intel is crazy. Now, that being said, Intel is not taking this lying down. They do have their new 10th gen chips, which as of recording have been announced, and I have not had my chance to benchmark yet.
However, the specs aren't impressive.
It's the same thing. So the problem is, and going back to my point earlier, Intel have had serious issues. They have not been able to iterate. So essentially, the core inside most Intel processors is called the Skylake core. This core originally came out as a 6th generation chip. And then they made it a little bit faster for the 7th gen, and a little bit faster for the 8th gen. And then they used it again for the 9th. And surprise, surprise, it's still in the 10th gen, right? So while they've added more cores, they've tried to bring up the frequencies as much as possible. But this is a very old design at this point, right? And they've had so many issues trying to really get things up to speed, whereas AMD have gotten lucky and made a lot of really smart decisions, and they've not had hardly any of these. And Intel has just not been able to keep up, which means that we live in this bizarre world where AMD, the company was almost bankrupt a little while ago, is now beating Intel, the company that is worth probably 20 times them. It's insane. This does not ever happen, just ever.
This is it, right? If Apple want to be able to provide the best possible experience, Intel's not giving it. And they haven't been for a while, and they're losing on every front right now.
So I probably shouldn't say this, but I'll say this anyway. I've had many conversations, specifically over the last year and a half, 2 years, something like that, with people who are integrated into the various places that we're talking about.
Yeah.
All right. And it has been a fairly open secret for a while that Apple is leaving Intel, right? Like this is something which has not been a surprise and everyone's been preparing for a while, right? And well before the things even got bad, right? Well before AMD was even really this competitive, right? I feel like this has surprised everyone.
The writing's been on the wall for a long time, right? Like Apple is a company that likes to own its entire stack, and this is effectively the only thing they have left that they don't have a hand in the design of.
Yes, exactly.
Because they even own a huge chunk of Corning, the Gorilla Glass people.
Yeah.
Right? Like, they have
that
all
much money.
Yeah.
Well, actually, that would be interesting to see if they like purchase some chunk of AMD or whatever as part of some future partnership or something. But essentially, it to me, it seems like AMD is in a really strong position. And let's not forget, Apple does take advantage of AMD graphics, right? So on like the MacBook Pros and on the iMacs, I mean, AMD graphics are the only option. You can't get NVIDIA graphics on a Mac right now. So obviously, Apple has a good relationship with AMD. And while I will say, I don't even know if AMD was really fully expecting the Ryzen Mobile 4000 to be this far ahead. I mean, you look at like the OEMs, right? Like companies, I mean, this is like a year plus process to integrate, a new chip and design a new laptop. Very few companies even realized how big of a jump this would be, which is why there are some Ryzen Mobile 4000 laptops, but they're not a lot because a year ago, most companies were like, oh, it'll be a little bit better, whatever. They don't think anyone realized, like, if you could tell Razer a year and a half ago how powerful these chips are, I bet you we would have a Razer Blade with Ryzen in it, right? Like, I mean, I think it's a huge surprise. So the fact is, it seems like Apple is at least experimenting with this kind of stuff. And I'm so curious to see, do they maybe throw a couple of like Zen cores into some future Mac where it's primarily running like, the ARM chip, but you might have a couple of cores for like backwards compatibility or something? Do they potentially take advantage of AMD graphics alongside the Apple designed CPUs or something? I don't know, but I'm in crazy wild conspiracy mode right now, man. I'm like, crazy stuff's about to happen. I don't know what it is, but I'm really excited, and I hope it gets nuts because it's a weird world we live in right now.
I think when it comes to looking at the landscape of processor architecture in all computers, it's going to change over the next couple of years in a way that it hasn't changed for about 10 or 15 years, right? Because
there's competition.
Yes.
There is competition now for the first time in a very long time. And it's might not be a good thing for Intel. It might mean that everyone has to kind of get a little bit more scrappy. But for us, the consumers who are using these things, this is great, right? Like everyone is having to finally fight for, it's not like, oh, we're going to be 2% faster or 5% faster. All these companies are really having to fight to not only just sort of like stay competitive, but in some cases to stay alive, right? Which means that we're getting some of the more unique, interesting, cool designs that we've had in a very long time.